Hi, this is Elder Vicki Baker reading a booklet written by Apostle Shane Vaughn titled The Fake Fathers of the Faith. Augustine versus Abraham, Irenaeus versus Isaac, Justin versus Jacob. Why the so-called church fathers cannot be doctrinal authorities, and why restoration comes through prophetic voice, not patristic consistence. This was written by Reverend John Shane Vaughn, founding apostolic overseer of First Harvest Ministries Internationals. Shall we begin? The introduction. The line in the sand. For too long, the Christian world has operated under an assumption so deeply embedded that most believers never think to question it. The assumption is this: since the apostles are gone, the church fathers must serve as our guides to authentic Christianity. They walk closer to the apostolic age. The reasoning goes, so surely they must have preserved what the apostles taught. Surely their consistency reflects the original faith. That assumption is false, and this book will prove it. This tragic misunderstanding flows from a deeper misunderstanding, one that has blinded generations of believers to what actually happened in the early centuries. Most Bible readers will expect the great falling away as an end-time event, something yet future, something that will occur just before the return of Messiah. They scan the headlines looking for signs and apostasy, never realizing that the apostasy already happened, long before the church fathers ever put hand to the quill. The great falling away did not wait for the last days. It began during the lifetime of the apostles themselves. Paul warned the Thessalonians that the mystery of lawlessness was already at work. He told Timothy that all those in Asia had turned away from him. He grieved that Demas had forsaken him, having loved this present world. John wrote that many antichrists have come, not will come, but have come. Peter warned of false teachers who would secretly bring in destructive heresies. Jude urged believers to contend earnestly for the faith, because certain men had crept in unnoticed. The apostasy was not future to them. It was present. It wasn't happening while they still lived, while they still wrote, while they still had authority to correct it. And if the falling away had already begun, why apostolic voices could still be heard? What happened when those voices fell silent? What happened when the last apostle was buried and no living witness remained who had walked with Yeshua or had been directly commissioned by him? What happened is exactly what we should expect. The falling away accelerated. The drift became a flood. The errors that had been resisted by the apostolic authority now grew unchecked. And the men we call church fathers, sincere as many of them were, wrote from within that fallen context. Their writings do not preserve pristine apostolic teaching. Their writings emerge from the great falling away that was already well underway before they were born. The early church fathers are not doctrinal authorities. They are post-apostolic men. Sincere, often courageous, sometimes brilliant. Stand had already begun to flicker. They did not restore the faith. They reacted to the chaos that followed when revolution withdrew from the earth. They did not preserve apostolic purity. They managed apostolic loss. And here is the harder truth that must be spoken plainly. Restoration was never promised to them. Yahweh never said, I will preserve my church through a succession of bishops. He never promised councils will guard my doctrine. He never declared philosophers trained in Greek academics will clarify my covenant. What he did say through the mouth of his own son was something else entirely. Matthew 17 verse 11 says, Elijah truly shall come first and restore all things. Not clarify, not systemize, not codify through escalational vote. Restore. That single word changes everything. It tells us that Yahweh always knew drift would come. He always knew that even sincere men working with limited texts and borrowed philosophies would reshape the faith into something the apostles would not recognize. And he always had a plan, not to preserve truth through institutions, but to restore it through the prophetic voice. This is the spine of everything that follows. The fathers are witnesses to what happened after the apostles. They are not authorities on what must be believed. They could tell us how certain bishops in certain cities understood certain texts at certain moments in history. They cannot tell us what Yahweh requires of his covenant people. Only scriptures can do that. And even scriptures must be read through the lens of restoration. Because Yahweh does not leave his people wandering in the dark forever. He sends voices. He raises up Elijahs. He rebuilds what has been torn down. The Father can tell us what happened. Only Scripture can tell us what must be believed. Let me be clear about what this book is not. It is not an attack on men who suffered for their faith. Many of the fathers endured persecution, imprisonment, and death rather than deny the name of Messiah. Their courage deserves honor. Their sincerity is not in question. But consider this, even the 7 churches of Revelation, churches with legitimate apostolic authority, churches that Yeshua himself addressed through John, were not beyond correction. They were not distant generations removed from the apostles. These were churches that existed while John still lived. They held fast to his name. They endured persecution. Some of them had not denied the faith even unto death. And yet Yeshua said to nearly every one of them, I have something against you. Ephesus had left its first love. Pergamos tolerated false teaching. Thyatira permitted Jezebel. Sardis was dead while leaving a name that it lived. Laodicea was lukewarm, wretched, blind, and naked. These were not accusations against pagans and heretics. These were accusations against churches that Yeshua acknowledged at his own. Churches with genuine faith, genuine suffering, genuine loyalty to his name. If Yeshua had something against churches that existed under his apostolic oversight, how much more might he have against those who come after the apostles were gone? If the 7 churches could drift while John still walked the earth, what happened when John was buried? If holding fast to his name and giving one's life did not guarantee doctrinal purity in the first century, why would we expect it to guarantee purity in the second or third? The seven churches proved the point. Faithfulness in persecution does not equal correctness in doctrine. A church can die for Messiah and still have things that Messiah holds against it. A believer can refuse to deny the name and still believe things that the name bearer never taught. But courage does not equal correctness. Sincerity does not equal authority. And martyrdom, however noble, does not make a man's theology binding on future generations. A man can die for a belief and still be wrong about many things. The question is not whether the fathers were brave. The question is whether their writings carry the weight of divine authority. They do not. We honor them as witnesses to a transitional era. We refuse to enthrone them as judges over the faith once delivered to the saints. What follows is the case, built on history, primary sources, and Scripture itself, for why the church fathers cannot bear the doctrinal weight that tradition has placed on them, and why the only hope for the people of Yahweh lies not in patristic consensus, but in prophetic restoration. The line is drawn. Let us begin. Part 1. What the early church actually looked like. A web, not a hierarchy. Before we can understand why the church fathers cannot be doctrinal authorities, we must first understand the world they inhabited. And the world of early Christianity looked nothing like what most believers imagine. When modern Christians think of the early church, they often picture something resembling a smaller, pure version of what exists today, perhaps with simpler buildings and more persecution, but essentially the same structure, a unified organization with agreed upon doctrines, a settled canon of Scripture, and a clear chain of command from top to bottom. That picture is a fantasy. The post-apostolic church was not a hierarchy. It was a web, a loose network of city-based assemblies scattered across the Roman Empire, connected not by institutional authority, but by letters, traveling teachers, shared suffering, and the fragile bonds of personal relationship. There was no Vatican. There was no Pope issuing universal degrees. There was no catechism that every believer confessed. There was not even agreement on which books belonged to the Scriptures. What there was instead was diversity. Genuine, sometimes chaotic, often contradictory diversity. And understanding this diversity is the first step toward understanding why no single father and no collection of fathers can speak for the early church as a whole. The major centers, different cities, different Christianities. Consider the major centers of early Christianity and notice how different they were from one another. Jerusalem was the mother church, the community that had known Yeshua in the flesh, that had received the spirit of Pentecost, that had been led by James the Just until his martyrdom. Jerusalem, Christianity was Torah-rooted, Hebrew in language and thought still connected to the temple calendar and the rhythms of covenant life that stretched back to Sinai. When the Jerusalem Council met in Acts 15, they did not abolish Torah. They clarified what was required of Gentile converts while assuming that Jewish believers would continue in the ways of their fathers. Antioch was different. A cosmopolitan city where the followers of Yeshua were first called Christians, a mixed community of Jews and Gentiles learning to navigate their differences. Antioch produced a style of biblical interpretation that emphasized the plain historical meaning of text, a contrast to what would develop elsewhere. Then you got Ephesus, carried the weight of Johannine tradition. John the Apostle reportedly spent his final years there. And the churches of Asia Minor, Smyrna, Pergam, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea, bore the marks of his teaching. These were communities that would later fight fiercely to preserve practices they believed they had received directly from apostolic hands. Rome was influential, certainly, but not yet supreme. The Roman Church gained prestige from its location in the imperial capital and from its association with the martyrdoms of Peter and Paul. But in the 2nd century, Rome was one voice among many, a voice that other churches sometimes resisted and occasionally rebuked. Alexandria was the intellectual center, home to the famous school where Clement and later Origen would develop a Christianity heavily influenced by Greek philosophy. Alexandria interpretation favored allegory, finding hidden spiritual meanings behind the plain words of Scripture. This approach would shape Christian theology for centuries, often in directions that the Hebrew apostles would never have recognized. These were not branch offices of a single corporation. They were distinct communities with distinct emphasis, distinct leadership structures, distinct access to apostolic writings, and distinct ways of reading whatever scripture they possessed. They were connected by the roads of the Roman Empire and the ships that crossed the Mediterranean, by letters that took weeks or months to arrive by travelers who carried news and teaching from city to city, but they were not unified in any institutional sense. Unity, such as it existed, was relational rather than organizational. It was the unity of a family, sometimes harmonious, often contentious, always complicated. The problem of incomplete scriptures. Here is a fact that most Christians have never considered. The early churches did not possess complete Bibles. The New Testament, as we know it, did not exist as a finished leather-bound collection. The writing that would eventually be gathered into the canon were produced over several decades and circulated unevenly across the Mediterranean world. One church might possess several of Paul's letters, another might have only one gospel. A third might read writings that would later be excluded from the canon altogether. The Hebrew scriptures were more widely available, usually in Greek translation known as the Septuagint. But even here, there was variation. Different communities accepted different books, and the boundaries of Scripture remained fluid for centuries. This matters enormously for how we evaluate the Fathers. When Origen develops his elaborate allegorical interpretations, we must ask, what text was he reading? And what text had he didn't even see? When Tertullian thunders against certain practices, we must ask, Was his position shaped by gaps in the biblical library? When bishops make sweeping doctrinal pronouncements, we must recognize that they were often working with incomplete information, reasoning from the fragments they possessed rather than from the full counsel of Scripture. A bishop in Alexandria might build an entire theological system on text that a bishop in Antioch has never encountered. And both might be completely unaware of tradition preserved in Jerusalem or Asia Minor that would have challenged their conclusions. This is not a minor qualification. It strikes at the very heart of authority. If the fathers were working with incomplete scriptures shaped by regional traditions and influenced by local philosophical currents, then their writings cannot possibly serve as a reliable guide to universal apostolic teachings. They can only tell us what certain men believe in certain places with certain limited resources. Worship in the early church, simple and varied. Forget the cathedrals, forget the elaborate liturgies, forget the vestments, the incense, the marble altars, and the stained glass windows. Early Christian worship was domestic, held in homes, courtyards, rented halls, and during times of persecution in hidden places like the catacombs beneath Rome. Archaeological evidence confirms this picture. The house church at Dura Europes, dating to the 3rd century, shows us what early Christian meeting spaces actually looked like. A converted home with the room adapted for assembly and another room outfitted as a baptismal. This was not exceptional. This was normal. For generations, believers gathered in spaces that would hold a few dozen people at most, meeting in intimate settings where everyone knew everyone else. The structure of worship was simple: readings from Scripture, whatever text the community possessed, teaching or exhortation, usually from the bishop or an elder. Prayers, a shared meal, and a collection for the needs of widows, orphans, and prisoners. Leadership was pastoral rather than imperial. The focus was on community, mutual care, and faithfulness in the face of a hostile world. But even this simple pattern varied from place to place. Some communities met on the Sabbath. Others met on Sunday. Some observed the memorial of Yeshua's death at Passover. Others did so weekly. Some retained strong connections to Jewish practices. Others were rapidly developing in Gentile directions. There was no universal liturgy, no common prayer book, no standardized order of service. What held them together was not uniformity of practice, but shared allegiance to Messiah, and even the allegiance that expressed in different ways in different places. Connected by letters, not by commands. How did these scattered communities stay in touch? Primarily through letters. Letters were the internet of the ancient world. Slow, unreliable, dependent on travelers willing to carry them, but absolutely essential for maintaining any sense of connection across distances. The apostles wrote letters. Their successors wrote letters. Churches wrote to other churches. Bishops wrote to bishops. When disputes arose, letters flew back and forth across the Mediterranean, sometimes taking months to arrive, often producing more confusion than clarity. Consider Clement, a letter from the church at Rome to the church at Corinth, addressing a leadership dispute. This is often cited as evidence of Roman authority over other churches. But read it carefully, and you will find something quite different. A letter of concern and counsel, not a papal decree. Rome offers advice. Rome does not issue commands. The very fact that such a letter was necessary proves that Rome could not simply impose its will on Corinth. Persuasion was required because institutional authority did not exist. The same pattern holds throughout the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Churches are connected by letters, by traveling teachers, by hospitality networks that allowed Christians to find welcome in distant cities, but they are not connected by any central command structure. There is no mechanism for enforcing uniformity. When disputes arise, and they arise constantly, they are resolved or not resolved through argument, negotiation, and the slow accumulation of consensus. This is the world the fathers inhabited, a world of genuine diversity, incomplete scriptures, regional variation, and relational, not institutional, unity. Any claim that the early church taught X must be evaluated against this reality. Which early church? Teaching what on the basis of which text? In response to which local circumstance? The myth of early uniformity must die before we can see the fathers clearly for what they actually were. Witnesses to a specific moment in a specific place, not authorities for all Christians in all times. Chapter 2. How bishops rose and ruled. If the early church was a web rather than a hierarchy, the bishops were the spiders, men who occupied positions of influence at the center of local communities whose teachings shaped the faith of everyone within their reach, and whose preferences gradually hardened into traditions that later generations would mistake for apostolic mandates. Understanding how bishops functioned and how they came to hold their positions is essential for evaluating the authority of the church fathers, because here is the uncomfortable truth. A bishop's theology tended to become his regent's theology. His interpretations became their interpretations. His blind spots became their blind spots. And whom later generations read his writings, they were reading not the faith once delivered to the saints, but the particular conclusions of a particular man in a particular city facing particular challenges with particular resources at his disposal. The rise of the strong bishop. The New Testament presents a picture of church leadership that was decidedly apostolic, not democratic, not merely collegial, but rooted in the undisputed authority of sent men. Paul was the undisputed authority over the churches he established. These was no question as to his authority, or else why would churches send letters to him seeking his judgment? Why would they wait for his rulings on disputes? Why would his letters carry the weight of command rather than mere suggestions? Paul established elders in every city, but those elders ruled in his stead and with his authority. They were extensions of apostolic oversight, not independent operators. This is why Paul instructs Timothy that the elders who rule well should be counted worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in the word of doctrine. The elders ruled. They exercised genuine authority, but the authority was delegated authority, derived from the apostle who had appointed them and accountable to the apostolic teaching they were charged to preserve. This is a crucial distinction. Apostolic authority was real, direct, and unquestioned. The apostles were not first among equals. They were sent ones, commissioned by Yeshua himself, bearing his authority to establish and govern his assemblies. When Paul spoke, he spoke with authority that no mere elder could claim. When he wrote, his letters were to be read as commandments of the Lord. But the early 2nd century, something had shifted. Though not in the way most critics suggest, in the letters of Ignatius of Antioch, written around 110 AD, as he traveled toward martyrdom in Rome, we see him urging churches to rally around their bishop as the center of unity. Let nothing be done without the bishop, he writes. Many have criticized Ignatius for this emphasis, as though he were inventing an illegitimate authorization. But we must tread carefully here. The premise of Ignatius was not wrong. Yahweh is a God of order, not chaos. His kingdom operates through government, through delegated authorities, through submission to those he has placed in positions of oversight. The assembly that rejects governmental authority rejects the pattern of heaven itself. Obedience to legitimate spiritual authority is not bondage. It is the structure within which covenant life flourishes. The problem was not the principle of episcopal authority. The problem was that men were rising among the wheat who lacked legitimate succession from the apostles. Men calling themselves bishops without the pure teachings of the apostolic era. The office was sound. The occupants were increasingly corrupted. The structure and goddess defended was being filled by men who had already begun to drift from Torah, who had already begun to absorb Greek philosophy, who had already begun to accommodate the faith of Gentile preferences. In other words, the tragedy of the post-apostolic period is not that churches had bishops. The tragedy is that the bishops stopped obeying Torah. The tragedy is that men who should have preserved the Hebrew roots of the faith instead grafted in foreign branches. The tragedy is that governmental authority, which is good and necessary, was exercised by men whose doctrine was already compromised. This is the crucial distinction. We do not reject church government. We reject governors who have abandoned the covenant. We do not reject the office of bishop. We reject bishops who no longer teach what the apostles taught. The answer to bad government is not no government. It is restored government, operating under restored doctrine, exercised by men who have returned to Torah and the testimony of Yeshua. How the bishops were chosen. If bishops held such influence, how did someone become a bishop in the first place? Not certainly, but papal appointment. The papacy, as later centuries understood it, did not yet exist. The early pattern was far more local and communal. The early church manual that probably dates to the late 1st or early 2nd century instructs communities to appoint for yourself bishops and deacons. Many scholars cite this language approvingly as though local selection were the original and proper pattern. But here is where the problem begins. Appoint for yourselves. This has never been Yahweh's pattern. He always appoints. Moses did not emerge from a congregation that voted him in. Aaron was not selected by popular acclaim. The judges were raised up by Yahweh, not elected by Israel. The prophets were called from above, not appointed from below. David was chosen by Yahweh and anointed by Samuel. The people had no say in the matter, and when they did choose for themselves, they chose Saul. When Yeshua established his assembly, he chose the 12. They did not volunteer, they did not campaign, they did not emerge from a selection committee. He called them, appointed them, sent them. Apostolic authority flowed downward from heaven, not upward from the congregation. The Diadoch's instruction, appoint for yourself, represents a departure from the apostolic pattern. It is the voice of assemblies that no longer have apostles among them, trying to figure out how to continue without direct heavenly appointment. It is pragmatic solution to an unpresented problem. What do you do when the sent ones are gone and no one new sent ones have come? But here is what the Diadoch's audience apparently did not know or choose to ignore. The sent ones had left behind their true, legitimate successors. The apostolic line did not simply vanish. It continued in Asia. John the Apostle, the last surviving pillar, the one who had leaned on Yeshua's breast, wore the penelon, the priestly frontlet that symbolized his authority as a priest of the Most High. And when John fell asleep, that penelon was handed down to Polycarp and to Papias, men who had sat at John's feet, who had heard his voice, who had received directly from his hands the deposit of apostolic teaching. History may lose their lineage. The institutional church, busy with its councils and creeds, may fail to trace the succession, but the saints did not lose it. Everyone who was paying attention knew who the true leaders were in the true assembly of Yahweh, not the assemblies with tainted teachings and congregational appointments, but the communities that had received the laying on of hands from those who had received it from the apostles themselves. This is the great tragedy. While some assemblies were inventing democratic processes to fill leadership vacuums, the legitimate successors continued. Quietly, faithfully, often persecuted by both Rome and the institutional church that claimed to be the true heir of the apostles. The line did not die. It went underground. It was marginally labeled Judaizing, eventually hunted, but it did not die. The answer that Diadoch gives, let the people choose, may have seemed reasonable, but it opened up the door to exactly the problems we have been tracing. When congregation appoints their own leaders, they tend to appoint men who reflect their own preferences, their own blind spots, their own level of understanding. A congregation drifting from Torah will not appoint a bishop who calls them back to Torah. A congregation comfortable with Greek philosophy will appoint a Greek trained in Greek philosophy. The selection process tends to confirm the drift rather than correct it. Yahweh's pattern is different. He sends whom he sends, whether the people want that man or not. He appoints the uncomfortable prophet, the confrontational voice, the one who will not tell the congregation what it wants to hear. Human selection produces leaders the people deserve. Divine appointment produces leaders the people need. By the 3rd century, we have more detailed testimony. Cyprian of Carthage states plainly that the people have the power either of choosing worthy priests or of rejecting unworthy ones. The congregation was genuinely involved in selecting its leadership. This is the evidence we need to prove that early Christianity was not yet beholden to Rome, though it was leaning over slightly towards that end. But the same evidence proves something else equally important. Before Rome consolidated its power, early Christianity cannot be credited with pure doctrine either. Each bishop chosen by the people brought his own doctrines, his own philosophical training, his own regional assumptions, his own incomplete library of text. The result was not a unified witness to apostolic truth. It was a disunit network of competing teachings, each city with its own flavor, each bishop with his own emphasis, each region developing in its own direction. This is not a foundation worthy of restored truth. This is not a golden age of which we should return. This is the evidence of drift, fragmentation, and loss. Communities doing their best without apostolic oversight, making decisions that seem right in their own eyes, producing a patchwork of Christianity that would eventually require imperial force to stitch its artificial unity. Once chosen by the community, the new bishop would typically be ordained by neighboring bishops, a kind of regional validation that connected the new leader to the broader network of churches. But the foundation was local, a man known to his community, recognized for his character and teaching, selected by those who would be under his care. This process had obvious strengths. It rooted leadership in relationship. It prevented distant authorities from imposing unsuitable leaders on unwilling communities. It ensured that bishops were, at least initially, men who had earned the trust of those that led. But it also had implications that are often overlooked. A bishop chosen by a community tended to reflect that community's values, preferences, and assumptions. A bishop in sophisticated Alexandria was likely to be philosophically sophisticated himself. A bishop in Torah observant Jewish communities was likely to share that observance. A bishop in Rome, increasingly Gentile and increasingly distant from Hebrew roots, was likely to develop in direction that made sense in Rome, but would have puzzled believers in Jerusalem. In other words, the selection process tended to reinforce regional distinctives rather than producing uniform leadership across the church. Each bishop was a product of his environment, and his teaching would bear the marks of that environment for better or worse. Regional flavors of Christianity. This is why early Christianity developed such distinct regional flavors, and why generationals about what the early church believed are almost always misleading. This also explains the very frustrating process that every serious Bible student encounters when attempting to study the church fathers. You go to them expecting clarity. You have been told they hold the keys to understanding the early faith. You have been conditioned by seminaries, by commentaries, by tradition itself, to look to them for the truth of that age. And what do you find? They all say something different. One father affirms that another denies. One region practices what another condemns. You search for consistency and find contradiction. You search for a unified voice and find a cacophony. The more deeply you study, the more frustrated you become, because the fathers do not deliver what you were promised they would deliver. The frustration is not a failure of your study. It is the fathers revealing what they actually are, witnesses to diversity and drift, not guardians of unified truth. The frustrations you feel is the sound of a myth collapsing. You were told the fathers agreed. They did not. You were told they preserved apostolic teaching. They preserved regional variations of post-apostolic speculation. The frustration is appropriate. It is the beginning of wisdom. Alexandria developed in one direction. The church there was heavily influenced by the intellectual culture of the city, one of the great centers of learning in the ancient world, home to a famous library and a tradition of philosophical inquiry. Alexandria Christians learned to read Scripture allegorically, finding the hidden meanings behind the plain words of the text, seeing spiritual truths encoded in every detail. Clement of Alexandria and his successor, Origen, built elaborate theological systems that drew freely on Platonic philosophy. They were brilliant men, but their brilliance was shaped by their context. Alexandria Christianity looked like Christianity filtered through Greek intellectual culture, because that is exactly what it was. Antioch developed differently. The church there favored what scholars called the literal or historical approach to Scripture, reading texts in their plain sense, attending to grammar and context, resisting the flights of allegorical fancy that characterized Alexandria. An Antioch bishop reading the same passage as an Alexandria bishop might read completely different conclusions, not because one was faithful and one was not, but because they had been trained in different interpretive traditions. Rome developed it in yet another direction, increasingly administrative, increasingly focused on structure and order, increasingly confident in its own authority. Roman Christianity took on the character of the imperial city, organized, efficient, and convinced of its own importance. Asia Minor preserved traditions that other regions were abandoning. Practices like observing Passover on the 14th of Nisan, regardless of what day of the week it fell on. Practices that believers there traced directly to the Apostle John. These were not innovations, they were conservations. But from Rome's perspective, they looked like deviations from an emerging norm. Did you notice something about all the regions mentioned above? Each held to a certain element of truth. Alexandria understood that Scripture contains layers of meanings. Allegory has its place when properly bounded by the historical sense. Antioch rightly insisted on the historical and grammatical foundation of interpretation. Asia Minor preserved the Bible calendar and the Passover observance. Rome, for all its later corruptions, understood the necessity of governmental structure and order. Each region had a piece. None had the whole. The tragedy of early Christianity is that these pieces were never assembled into a unified whole under legitimate apostolic authority. Instead, each region developed its peers in isolation, often in opposition to what other regions were developing. The allegorists despised the literist. The calendar keepers were condemned by those who had abandoned the feast. The governmental minded used their structures to suppress rather than unite. What would it look like if a community held all of these together? Allegoria bounded by historic, the biblical calendar with its Passover and feast, proper government structured under apostolic authority, historical grammatical interpretation as the foundation with spiritual application built upon it. This is not impossible. This is what restoration looks like. Gathering the scattered pieces, reassembling what fragmentation divided, holding together what the early centuries pulled apart. The point is not that one region was right and the others wrong. The point is that there was no single early church teaching on most questions. There were regional teachings, plural, shaped by local bishops, local circumstances, local access to text, and local culture influences. When we read the Fathers, we are not reading the voice of the early church. We are reading the voices of specific men in specific places, wrestling with specific challenges from specific perspectives. That is a very different thing. The bishop problem. Here then is the mechanism by which local custom became universal myth. A bishop in a major city develops certain teachings and practices. His community adapts them. His letters are copied and circulated. Further generations in other places read his writings and assume they are encountering the faith of the early church. Meanwhile, the teachings and practices of bishops in other cities, teaching that might have been equally valid, equally ancient, equally rooted in apostolic tradition, are lost, suppressed, and labeled as deviations. What survives is not necessarily what was original. What survives is what was powerful enough to be preserved. What was written in places with good copying facilities and wide distribution networks, what fit the theological trajectory that eventually won out. The winners write history, and the winners preserve their own writings while allowing rival traditions to disappear. This is why the claim of unanimous consent of the fathers is so misleading. Why do we have access to the full range of early Christian teaching? We have access to what survived. And what survived was filtered through the preferences and power structures of later centuries. The fathers we can read are not necessarily representative of the fathers who existed. They are the ones whose writings were deemed worth preserving by those who came after. Imagine this with me. You are in a library, perhaps in some of the monastery archives or university collection, and you discover an old letter written by a church leader from one remote area. As you begin to read, you realize this man writes with authority. His theological reasoning is sharp. His knowledge of the Hebrew scriptures is profound. Perhaps he is a legitimate Zadok priest descended from the lineage that flowed through John the Apostle and his successors. Perhaps he represents that underground stream we spoke of earlier, the true succession that history lost, but the saints preserved. But as you read further, you notice something else. His teaching is so far from where the institutional church eventually evolved that it would have seemed foreign, even dangerous, to those who controlled the libraries. His letter was not thrown away. That would have been too obvious. It was simply not copied, not promoted, not circulated. It sat on a shelf while other writings were duplicated and distributed. And eventually, inevitably, it was lost in time. The parchment crumbled, the ink faded, and with its vanished a witness to apostolic truth that might have changed everything. Now ask yourself, what would happen if we would read his writings today? What if that letter survived? What doctrines that we consider settled might be unsettled? What practices that we consider ancient might be revealed as innovations? What traditions that we consider apostolic might be exposed as departures? The absence of that letter, and thousands of letters like it, is not neutral. It is a silence that speaks. It tells us that what survived is not necessarily what was true. It is what was powerful enough to be preserved by those who had the power to preserve it. When we recognize this, the authority of the fathers begins to crumble. We are not hearing the voice of the early church. We are hearing the voices that latter generations chose to amplify. Voices that served certain interests, supported certain theologies, and reinforced certain power structures. And here, I wish to make something very plain, something that strikes at the very title we have given these men. The only true early church fathers are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. These are the fathers of the faith. These are the patriarchs to whom the promises were made. These are the men whose covenant Yahweh remembers, whose seed inherits the blessings, whose God is the God we serve. When Scripture speaks of the fathers, it does not mean Origen or Tertullian or Clement. It means Abraham, who believed Yahweh, and it was counted to him as righteousness. It means Isaac, the son of promise. It means Jacob, whom Yahweh loved and renamed Israel. And what did Yahweh promise through Malachi? What is the final word of the Hebrew prophets before 400 years of silence? Malachi chapter 4 verses 5 and 6 says, "Behold, I will send you Elijah, the prophet, before the coming of the great and dreadful day of Yahweh. And he shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse." Elijah's mission is to turn hearts back to the fathers. Not to Ignatius, not to Augustine, but to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The restoration that is coming is not a return to the 2nd century. It is a return to the patriarchs, to the covenant, to the faith that existed before Greek philosophy corrupted it, before Rome power institutionalized it, before the men we wrongly call fathers led the people away from the true fathers of our faith. The bishops were influential men, but their influence was local. Their knowledge was limited. Their perspectives were shaped by their environments, and their survival in the historical record was determined by factors that had nothing to do with their faithfulness to apostolic truth. They deserve to be read. They do not deserve to be obeyed. Chapter 3. The Sabbath versus Sunday. 2 rhythms, not one. If the early church was truly unified around apostolic teaching, one would expect to find uniformity on basic questions of practice. When do believers gather? What did they observe. Surely, if there was one faith handed down from the apostles, there would be one day as well. But the evidence tells us a very different story. The early church was divided on the question of sacred time. Some communities gathered on the seventh-day Sabbath, continuing the pattern established at creation and enshrined in the Ten Commandments. Others gathered on the first day of the week, honoring the day of Yeshua's resurrection. Still others observed both days in different ways. This diversity persisted for centuries and only ended when imperial power intervened to enforce uniformity. The calendar controversy is one of the clearest windows into early Christian diversity, and it exposes the myth of patriast consistency more clearly than almost any other issue. Justin Martyr, one witness, not the whole story. Justin Martyr is one of the most frequently cited witnesses to early Christian practice. Writing in Rome around 150 AD, he describes believers gathering on the day called Sunday for readiness from the memoirs of the apostles and the prophets, following by teaching prayers and the Eucharist. This passage is often quoted as proof that the early church universally observed Sunday worship. But this conclusion requires us to make Justin say more than he actually says. Justin is describing what happened in Rome in the mid-2nd century in the particular communities he knew. He is not claiming to describe universal practice. He is not issuing a mandate. He is not even arguing that Sunday observance is the only legitimate option. He is simply reporting what his community did. Justin was a Gentile convert, trained in Greek philosophy, writing to explain Christianity to a Roman audience in terms they could understand. His testimony tells us that by this time, in his location, Sunday gathering had become standard practice. It tells us nothing about what was happening in Jerusalem, in Antioch, in Ephesus, or in the countless smaller communities scattered across the empire. To take one man's description of one community's practice and universalize it as the teaching of the early church is exactly the kind of overreach that has distorted our understanding of early Christianity for centuries. Justin is a witness. He is not the only witness, and his testimony must be set alongside the testimony of others who tell a very different story. The survival of Sabbath observance. Here is a fact that should make every thoughtful Christian pause. Centuries after the apostles, church councils were issuing decrees against Sabbath observance. You do not legislate against something that does not exist. The Council of Laodicea, meeting in the 4th century, issued Canon 29. Christians must not Judaize by resting on the Sabbath, but must work on that day, rather honoring the Lord's Day, and if they can, resting then as Christians. But if any shall be found to be Judaizers, let them be anathema from Christ. Read that decree carefully. It is not describing an ancient battle already won. It is fighting a current war. It is commanding Christians to stop doing something that significant numbers of Christians were still doing, resting on the Sabbath. It is threatening those who persist with the ultimate escalatio punishment, anathema. This tells us something crucial. Sabbath observance did not quietly disappear in the 1st century. It persisted. It persisted long enough and broadly enough to require official condemnation by a church council hundreds of years after the apostles. The practice was considered serious enough to warrant the language of anathema, eternal separation from Messiah. Why would the council react so strongly if Sabbath observance was merely a fringe practice held by a handful of eccentrics? The intensity of the response reveals the persistence of the practice. Sabbath-keeping Christians were numerous enough, visible enough, and theologically competent enough to constitute a threat to the emerging uniformity that imperial Christianity demanded. Eusebius and the evidence of diversity. Even Eusebius of Caesarea, the great the church historian who wrote to celebrate the triumph of Constantinian Christianity, preserves evidence of early diversity that undermines later claims of uniformity. Eusebius mentioned groups who observed the Sabbath while also honoring the first day of the week. Communities that saw no contradiction between the two observances. For these believers, the Sabbath remained the Sabbath, the day established at creation and commanded at Sinai. The first day was honored as the day of resurrection, but honoring it did not require abandoning the older observance. This is not rebellion against apostolic teaching. This is continuity with apostolic teaching. The early Jewish believers in Yeshua did not stop being Jewish when they came to faith. They continued attending synagogue. They continue observing the feast, continued keeping Sabbath. They added new practices, baptisms, the memorial meal, gatherings centered on the teaching of the apostles, but they did not subtract the practices of the covenant that Yeshua himself had observed. The communities of Eusebius describe the communities that Laodicea condemns are not innovators. They are conservatives. They are preserving patterns that go back to the apostles and beyond the apostles to the covenant of Sinai. It is the Sunday-only position that represents innovation in adaptation of the faith of Gentile culture, preferences, and accommodations that eventually become mandatory through the exercise of imperial power. The honest picture. When we put all the evidence together, a clear picture emerges. But it is not the picture that tradition has painted. The early church was divided on the question of which day to observe. Some gathered on Sabbath, some gathered on Sunday. Some observed both. This diversity was not a scandal to be suppressed, but a reality to be acknowledged. For generations, believers with different practices coexisted within the broad family of those who confessed Yeshua as Messiah. But it should be noted, this confusion was a fresh confusion. This apostolic era of the assembly knew no such division. Yeshua kept the Sabbath. The apostles kept the Sabbath. Paul went to the synagogue on the Sabbath, as his manner was. The Jerusalem's council never once suggested that Gentile believers should abandon the seventh day. The book of Acts records Sabbath observance as the norm, not the exception. The confusion over which day to observe only emerges 100 years later, after the apostles had fallen asleep, after the Hebrew roots of the faith had begun to wither, after Gentile preferences had begun to reshape the practice of assemblies that no longer had apostolic oversight. What we see in Justin Martyr and others is not apostolic Christianity. It is post-apostolic drift. The diversity is real, but it is the diversity of departure, not the diversity of the original faith. The movement toward Sunday uniformity was gradual, driven by the growing influence of Gentile Christianity, the desire to distinguish the church from the synagogue, and even the power of imperial decree. By the 4th century, the bishops who gathered at councils represented a Christianity that had largely abandoned its Hebrew roots, and they used their newfound imperial backing to enforce their preferences on communities and had preserved older patterns. When we read Justin Martyr, then we must read him honestly. He is not describing the practice of the early church. He is describing the practice of his church, a Gentile community in Rome that had already moved away from patterns still being observed elsewhere. His testimony is valuable as evidence of diversity. It is worthless as a mandate for uniformity. And when defenders of Sunday observance point to Justin as proof that the apostles established Sunday worship, we must ask the obvious question. If the apostles clearly established Sunday observance, why were councils still fighting Sabbath keepers 300 years later? Why the need for anathemas if the matter had been settled from the beginning? The persistence of Sabbath observance is the smoking gun. It proves that the early church was not unified on this question. It proves that the patristic writers who favored Sunday were not speaking for the church, but for one trajectory within a divided movement. And it proves that ununiformity came not from apostolic mandate, but from imperial enforcement. Justin Martyr does not define early Christian worship. He witnesses to one stream among many. Chapter 4, Communion, Weekly versus Passover Anchored. The calendar dispute in early Christianity went beyond the question of weekly observance. It extended to the most sacred memorial that believers observed, the remembrance of Yeshua's death. When should this memorial be kept? How often? On what day? These questions divided the early church more sharply than almost any other. And the controversy that erupted exposes once again the myth that the Father spoke with one voice. The Quartodecimi reality. In the regions of Asia Minor, the very regions where John the Apostle had lived and taught, believers maintained a practice that differs sharply from what was developing in Rome. They observed the memorial of Yeshua's death on the 14th day of the Jewish month of Nisan. Regardless of what day of the week that date fell on, the 14th of Nisan was, of course, the date of Passover, the day when the lambs were slain, the day when Israel remembered her deliverance from Egypt, the day when Yeshua himself had been crucified as the true Passover lamb. These believers were called Quartodecimians, from the Latin word for 14, and they were not a fringe sect. They represented the practice of entire regions, including churches that traced their traditions directly to apostolic founders. They claimed with confidence that their practice came from the apostles themselves. Consider the weight of their claim. Asia Minor was where John had lived, where Polycarp had been trained by John, where Philip the evangelist had settled. If any region could claim authentic apostolic tradition, it was this one. And this region observed the memorial on Passover, not on a weekly basis, but on a Sunday that might fall anywhere in the calendar, but on the specific day that Yeshua had died. Meanwhile, Rome was developing a different practice, observing the resurrection on the Sunday following Passover, and eventually decoupling the Christian celebration from the Jewish calendar entirely. The Roman practice would eventually become what we call Easter, calculating independently a Passover, always falling on a Sunday, disconnected from the biblical calendar that Yeshua and the apostles had observed. Polycarp and Anicetus, diversity without division. The most instructive episode in the controversy occurred in the mid-2nd century when Polycarp of Smyrna traveled to Rome to meet with Anicetus, the Bishop of Rome. Polycarp was a heavyweight. He had been trained by John the Apostle. He was a living link to the apostolic age. He carried the authority that comes from direct connection to those who had walked with Yeshua, and he came to Rome as a representative of the Quattrodeciman practice. The practice he insisted that he had received from John himself. Anicetus was no lightweight either. As Bishop of Rome, he resented one of the most influential churches in the empire. He was committed to the developing Roman practice of Sunday observance. The two men met. They discussed. They disagreed. Neither would budge. Polycarp would not abandon the practice he had received from an apostle. Anicetus would not adopt a practice that differed from Roman custom. Stop and consider what has actually happened in this meeting. It is frightening when you see it clearly. Here stands Polycarp, the man who had sat at the feet of John the Apostle, who had received the Penelon, who carried the legitimate Zadokite priesthood succession, who represented the true apostolic faith in Asia. He is the real thing. His authority flows from Yeshua through John to himself. His practice is not innovation, but inheritance. And he has traveled to Rome to meet with whom? A man whose authority derives from not from apostolic succession through legitimate channels, but from the emerging power structures of an increasingly Gentile church. Anicetus represents Roman custom, Roman preference, Roman accommodation to a world that found Torah inconvenient. The true priest meets the pretender. The legitimate heir meets the usurper. And what happens? The pretender does not bow to legitimacy. Tradition has already become so ingrained, the falling away has already fallen so far. That Rome can look the true apostolic succession in the face and say, we will not change. They withstand legitimacy for the sake of leniency to the Torah. They prefer their comfortable departures to the demanding truth that Polycarp represents. This is not merely a disagreement between equals. This is the moment when institutional power began to outweigh apostolic authority. When the weight of Romans' custom proved heavier than the testimony of a man who had heard John's voice and received John's mantle. The tragedy is not that they disagreed. The tragedy is that Rome felt entitled to disagree with the living link to the apostles. And then something remarkable happened. They parted in peace. They remained in fellowship despite their disagreement. This is the crucial point. In the mid-2nd century, it was still possible for Christians to disagree on the fundamental questions and remain in communion with one another. Rome did not claim the authority to compel Asia Minor to conform. Asia Minor did not break fellowship with Rome over the difference. Diversity was tolerated because no single bishop or church had the power to impose uniformity. That situation would not last. Victor's power play. A few decades later, Victor became Bishop of Rome. And Victor was not content to tolerate diversity. He demanded that the churches of Asia Minor abandon their Quattrodecuman practice and conform to Roman custom. When they refused, he attempted to excommunicate them, to cut them off from fellowship with the rest of the church. This was unprecedented. A bishop of Rome was claiming authority not merely over his own church, but over churches in distant regions, churches with their own apostolic traditions, churches that had been observing their practice for generations. Polycrates of Ephesus responded with a letter that deserves to be quoted. We observe the exact day, neither adding nor taking away. For in Asia also great lights have fallen asleep, which shall rise again on the day of the Lord's coming. Among these are Philip, one of the 12 apostles, who fell asleep in Hierapolis, and moreover John, who was both a witness and a teacher, who reclined upon the bosom of the Lord, and Polycarp in Smyrna, who was a bishop and martyr. All these observed the 14th day of the Passover, according to the gospel, deviating in no respect, but following the rule of faith. This is not the language of innovation. This is the language of inheritance. Polycrates is not claiming to have invented something new. He is claiming to have preserved something old, something received from apostles, something maintained by martyrs, something rooted in the rule of faith and the gospel itself. Victor's attempted excommunication provoked outrage. Other bishops intervened, urging him to back down. The unity of the church, they argued, should not be shattered over differences in calendar observance. Victor's heavy-handed approach was criticized even by those who had shared his preference for Sunday celebration. The immediate crisis passed, but the precedent had been set. A bishop of Rome had claimed the authority to excommunicate entire regions for failing to conform to Roman practice. The assertion of that authority, whether successful or not, marked a turning point. What Victor attempted, later bishops would accomplish. The lesson of the Quartodeciman controversy. What does this controversy teach us about the church fathers and their authority? First, it teaches us that the early church was genuinely divided on a question that touched the very heart of faith. The memorial of Yeshua's death was not a minor matter. It was central to Christian identity. And on this central question, believers disagreed, not because some were faithful and others were rebellious, but because different communities had received different traditions and neither could prove that the other was wrong. Second, it teaches us that claims of apostolic authority were made on both sides. Rome claimed tradition, Asia Minor claimed tradition. Both believed they were preserving what they had received. Both accused the other of innovation. The mere fact that a practice was called apostolic did not settle the question because the label was applied to contradictory practices. Third, it teaches us that uniformity came through the exercise of power, not through the discovery of truth. The Quartodeciman practice was eventually suppressed, not because anyone proved it was wrong, but because the Roman practice had the backing of imperial authority. When councils finally settled the question, they settled it by decree, enforced by the power of Christian emperors who had no interest in tolerating diversity. The fathers of both sides of this controversy were sincere men defending what they believed to be authentic tradition. Their sincerity is not in question. What is in question is whether either side can claim to speak for the early church as a whole. The answer is clearly no. The early church was divided. The fathers were divided, and the uniformity that later emerged was not the triumph of truth, but the triumph of power. This concludes part 1 of the fake fathers of the faith. For more information about the writings and booklets of Reverend John Shane Fawn, our apostle, you can go to hiscomingkingdom.com, where thousands of references are there freely to look at.